أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum everyone, and thank you very much for all being here. We're delighted and honoured to have with us today Professor Ovamir Anjum, who's come over from the good old United States of America. Professor Ovamir is the Imam Khattab Endowed Chair of Islamic Studies at the University of Toledo. His work is extremely wide-ranging, examining theology, ethics, law and politics in Islam and in comparison to Western thought. Professor Ovamir has a master's in computer science and a bachelor's in nuclear engineering and physics. He also has a master's in social sciences from the University of Chicago and a PhD in Islamic intellectual history from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's also studied Islam with a broad range of scholars in Pakistan, Saudi Arabia and America, and with scholars from Syria and Egypt's Al-Azhar. Professor Ovamir is the author of Politics, Law and Community in Islamic Thought, the Taymiyyan Moment, and he's editor-in-chief at the Yaqeen Institute. He wrote an essay published by Yaqeen in 2019 which garnered considerable attention, entitled Who Wants the Caliphate? He has since founded the Ummatics Institute, which aims to bring people together to conceptualize and help realize the reintegration of Muslim regions into a prosperous and virtuous civilization. Today, Professor Ovamir's talk will inshallah address the question of whether Muslims can think and act politically as Muslims in the modern world, and of whether politics must be reimagined for Muslims to be empowered as fully autonomous actors. Inshallah, we'll have a Q&A afterwards, so please do hold on to any questions or thoughts that you have for after the talk. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Professor Ovamir.
Thank you very much. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Allahumma laka alhamdu hatta tarda, wa laka alhamdu idha radit, wa laka alhamdu ba'da ar-rida, wa laka alhamdu hamdan kathiran tayyiban mubarakan fih. So my topic today is ummatics. What is ummatics? And the subtitle explains what is ummatics, which is, can Muslims think as Muslims? And ummatics is an attempt to answer that answer in the affirmative, that yes, we can. So let me begin this story of Muslims being Muslims some 700 years earlier than the abolition of the caliphate in 1924, which occurred about 100 years ago. We'll begin with the Mongol conquest of Baghdad, which took place in 1258 or 656 of the Hijri calendar. And it was an event that was so catastrophic that in the entire eastern half of the Islamic world, the Persian-speaking half was cut off. There were cities, multiple cities, where the population was several million, who were completely destroyed, and towers of skulls were made in that process, whether it's Marv or Nishapur, and then finally Baghdad itself. And up till that point, which is 7 centuries after the beginning of Islam, and 7 or so centuries before today, right in the middle of this eventful history of Islam, you had this real catastrophic event in which the Eastern Arabic-speaking half of the Islamic world was severed from the Eastern Persian-speaking half was severed from the Western Arabic-speaking half. And the Mongols continued to press on. They took Syria, and finally, famously, they were defeated by the Mamluks, slave soldiers, who in fact had also come from the northern slave soldier stock, and where they finally defeated the Mongols in 1260, which which only halted the Mongol advance for a period of time. One historian describes the event and its aftermath as if you imagined New York being destroyed by a nuclear weapon, meaning absolutely everything about Baghdad is destroyed and it's never recovered. That is the basis of prosperity of Iraq, and particularly Baghdad, was its canals, its agricultural and irrigation system, which could never be recovered. At that time, Muslim historians did not have words to describe what had happened. After that, as people began to write that history, they only could imagine that the day of judgment is near. The genre about the signs of the last day became very popular, and people expected further signs, the day of judgment to show up, and then the final judgment. People tried to cope with what the Mongols, Genghis Khan, had done in very odd ways, one of which was to consider him a saint who had been sent to punish Muslims for their sins. In fact, Christians who had been affected by the Mongol onslaught did precisely the same. In this great work that was written a century or so later in Egypt in Arabic by this essayist and author Numairi, he writes this story about Genghis Khan, which says that he was a waliullah, and once when people would visit him, he would not speak a word to them, but he would dance for the love of God. Once a rabbi visited him, and he asked him, "What gave you such nearness to God?" He said, "Because I always follow the Sharia and never eat haram meat. I eat kosher." So this personage, this godly personage, prophesies that he will become the master of the world, and that is why God has given him this power. So Muslims survived through mythology, through the stories of end times, and anticipated the world to be over. This was 13th century, the middle of the 13th century. Shortly after that, started this new regime of slave soldiers, the Mamluks, in the area that is now Syria and Egypt. The Mongols never made it past Syria, and for the next 200 years, this Mamluk period became oddly and strangely, but surely one of the most productive periods in Islamic scholarship. Nearly every madhab, whether it's legal madhab or theological madhab, or even historians' madhab, traces their most important works to this period, whether it is Ibn Daqiq al-Eid or Izzuddin ibn Abd al-Salam or Ibn Taymiyyah or Ibn al-Qayyim or al-Mizzi or al-Dhahabi or then Ibn Khaldun and finally al-Shatibi and many, many more. Those are the masters of the trade, whether it's jurisprudence or usul or fiqh, but especially history. People like Ibn Taghribirdi and then Ibn Khaldun al-Maqrizi. You begin to write history of everything. It's one of the richest documented period that shows the richness of the Islamic world. In the 14th century, there were also the beginnings on the border of Islam of a new dynasty who became known as Osmanli, the Ottomans later, and which began as Ghazis on the border and began to take more and more territory, joining small Muslim princelets, and by 1453, that is middle of the 15th century, they had taken Constantinople, which was the single most important city in the world at the time, the only one that the early Muslim armies could not take. And to use the words of Marshall Hodgson, one of the most perceptive historians of Islam and Islamic intellectual history, that if a Martian had visited the earth in the year 1500, he would have concluded that shortly the entire planet would be Muslim. Islam was spreading. The Ottoman Empire was the most robust empire, and surely for the next several centuries, Islam spread, became more established, and in some ways Islamic scholarship flourished. Maybe in other ways it didn't. We can talk about that later. But this was, of course, centuries and centuries of rise and efflorescence and progress, one would say, after people thought very seriously that time had ended, that Day of Judgment was near, that Muslims were no more, and that Muslims only deserved punishment. This is an apt, I think, way to think about the time that we live today, a century after the formal abolition of the caliphate. Of course, the caliphs had lost power well before 1924, but it was not sure until that very year that even the symbol of the caliphate is going to be eliminated. And that symbol still mattered tremendously. It almost had a metaphysical meaning for Muslims. For centuries before that, Muslims, no matter where they were, thought of themselves as in a kind of continuity with the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That's what the word Khalifa means. The word Khalifa is two kinds of continuities. There is a temporal continuity, and then there is a spatial, if you will, continuity. Khalifa is someone who connects Muslim ummah, Muslim existence in time, all the way to the Prophet, peace be upon him. But also spatially, the Khalifa is the center point at which represents the ummah. So rulers who govern, usually they governed independently and perhaps not very well often, as political things go, but they nevertheless governed in the name of the Khalifa. There would be a formal letter of investiture, document that would say, you govern in my name. And of course, that means you govern by the authority of God and His Messenger. This was enormously important because this meant that you did not have to metaphysically think of yourself as existing on a plane of existence, a secular plane of existence, in which you defined your ultimate sovereignty and ultimate belonging by some other criterion, by some other master signifier than Allah and His Messenger. That, of course, came to be the case over the course of the 20th century, and by the time after the Second World War, when the new Muslim states are born, they increasingly make the choice. In fact, it's a choice that they often made. It wasn't necessarily predestined to become territorially defined nation states. Today, Muslims, on the one hand, have numerically expanded tremendously. Muslims are, in some ways, perhaps as a gift of globalization, are more numerous, more widespread, and more resourceful than they have been for centuries. Yet also, those Muslims who do not have the protections, the minority of Muslims in the world have some protections, even if they are fragile protections of various nation states, particularly in the West. The vast majority of Muslims do not have those protections. And even those who do have protections of weak fledgling nation states that are usually weak and dependent, they don't really enjoy anything nearing a decent life where they have time to think or flourish, either in flourish in a worldly sense or in the sense of virtue or spirituality or faith, because they simply do not have time to think. They do not have the protections and safeties that we enjoy. And this is why I speak to you today about ummatics. So let me talk a little bit about why I use a term that is new to most ears. It's a term I coined, or I should say other people before me, other scholars, have used it. Professor Ismail Faruqi, rahimahullah, did use that term, ummatic, but mostly in an adjectival sense, as that which belongs to the ummah. But ummatics is a noun that has some substance, and I want to talk about what that substance is today. When writing my book or my dissertation in the years between 2003 and 2007, I reflected on early Islamic history and thought about what is it that Islamic political thought talks about, and why is it that Islamic political thought, whether you're reading Imam Abul Hassan Ali al-Mawardi's book, Al-Ahkam al-Sultaniya, or Ibn Taymiyyah's Al-Siyasa al-Shar'iyya, or Al-Ghazali's Fadaya al-Batiniya, or Al-Juwayni's Al-Ghiyathi, when you're reading those books, why is it that those books sound so strange? They start with different kind of problems that a book on political science or political theory, and they have different sources of authority. Why is it that they're just talking about faith? First of all, why they start with Khalifa? They start with the virtues of the Khalifa. They start with ethics and morality, right? The qualifications of the Khalifa. They talk with faith. They talk about historical events in the moment of the birth of Khilafah, and then they go on to describe how Khalifa must implement the law that has already been given. Again, all of this stuff is very different to what one reads in books of political science. The conclusion, or rather, I will not tell you the conclusion. For that, you'll have to read the book yourself, which is available for a very modest price of $30 at your own bookstores. That was just a joke, but please do buy the book. That is, in fact, was published by Cambridge University Press, 2012. But I will tell you how I expressed the conclusion, which was that instead of politics, they're talking about ummatics. That's why you don't find politics, conventionally speaking, modern Western notion of politics there. In fact, if you read Greek politics, you might find a little more familiarity with the Greek notion of politics, whether Plato or Aristotle. Nevertheless, they're still different, because the concern is with God and with the law. The concerns that you don't have. Of course, if you read Plato's Laws, then you do find there is a remarkable similarity there. But It is ummatics. It is concern with the ummah, concern with the faith community, that, and its continuity, its dual continuity with the Prophet in time and its spatial continuity at any moment in time with each other, its solidarity. Those are the concerns that they have put as the centerpieces of that discipline. So, over the years, as I've thought about it, and I've seen Muslim situation, older theories of what has happened to Muslims become worn out, not necessarily disproved, but older visions of what Muslims ought to do that emerged in late 20th century during the Cold War, post-Cold War era, seem to be losing any luster, any relevance, and most attempts at adjusting to the nation-state have made things from bad to worse. I thought I'll do something about it by perhaps writing, and so I wrote an article, Who Wants the Caliphate, which the Yaqeen Institute published at the end of 2019, and that is the endeavor that I want to talk to you about today. The Ummatics Institute was later established only a year ago to study the ummah, to think about the caliphate, but bottom up and perhaps on all different ways, with full resources of modern empirical methods, modern sciences, as well as Islamic studies and Islamic history, which is in full light, and therefore we can do much better than earlier generations, while also building on the wonderful work that earlier Muslims have done. I by no means want to say that Muslims have failed utterly. In fact, nothing can be further from the truth. Over the course of the 20th century, despite various kinds of political failures or elite failures, the Muslim ummah has thrived, multiplied. In fact, Muslims go from being 10% of the total world population in 1900 to about 25 to 30% today, and that number is increasing, and this is with the nearly several-fold increase in world population. So Muslims have increased in numbers. Now, of course, one might say the increase in numbers is not such a great achievement, is it? But in fact, it is. It means the Muslims have still the basic virtues that best of human civilizations were able to figure out: the virtue of having a family, the virtue of loving children, the virtue of honoring parents. Those are the virtues that make it that are necessary for a civilization to continue, and those are virtues that certainly our ummah, even when all things have been falling out, they have lived on in the hope and passed on the faith down to many of you. But at the same time, the pain of the ummah is increasing. It's as Samuel Huntington brutally said, this is an ummah where the borders of the Muslim world are bleeding. And when somebody pushed back, I believe it's an anecdote, Professor John Esposito, who wants to be very sympathetic to Muslims, he said to Samuel Huntington, well, that's such a bad thing to say, isn't it? Well, he said it's not just the borders of the Muslim world, its innards are also bleeding. You just don't want to see it. I think that Muslims, right, we as Muslims cannot deny and turn away from the fact that, yes, our borders and our innards are bleeding, that there are many Muslims, increasing number of Muslims that are without any protection, and that those of us who have the privilege of the blessing of Islam and the ability to think and write and speak and to recognize the ummah, the truth, that has been passed down to us through the agency of the ummah, we must think as an ummah, think for those who are suffering and whose voice cannot be heard. Ummatics, then, is a conceptual space where Muslims can think as Muslims. It is a conceptual space where Muslim agency is discussed, meditated on, and actualized. It is to the ummah what politics is to a territorial state. But it is more. It is also a way for Muslims, no matter where they are, to carry on the mission of the Prophet as given in the Quran. كنتم خير أمة أخرجت للناس تأمرون بالمعروف وتنهون عن المنكر وتؤمنون بالله. You are the best of communities, brought forth for humankind. You command what is good, you forbid what is evil, and you believe in God. وكذلك جعلناكم أمة وسطا لتكونوا شهداء على الناس ويكون الرسول عليكم شهيدا. Thus we have made you the middle, balanced, and just community, so that you bear witness to humankind just as the Prophet has borne witness to you, which both of these verses and nearly all such foundational verses do something very interesting, as one scholar has observed. They do two things. One, they refer to the inner virtue of the ummah, which requires commanding right, forbidding wrong, correcting each other, living a virtuous life. But also they turn our attention outward toward humankind. So we must, even as we are bleeding, even as we are suffering at the hands of the world, we must also be prepared to give and share the truth that God has given us, rather than be overwhelmed or just sit and take it or plot revenge. And that's only possible, I believe, when we think and feel as an ummah. And what better place than this quiet, sleepy town of Cambridge to start that. And there it is. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Professor, for that remarkable and enlightening talk. We now have time for Q&A. So if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand and then wait for the mic to be brought around. That's for recording purposes. So it won't actually make your voice louder, so you'll still have to project, I'm afraid. Do we have any questions? Brother at the front first.
So you mentioned about Cambridge being very sleepy and very good place to start. Since we are here, let's talk about the Neotraditionalist movement. How do you see to create a Khilafah from where we are now? How do you see a Neotraditionalist movement that sort of has a disproportionate loyalty to the current nation state and the power structure? How do you see them buffering the whole idea of a Khilafah? I'm assuming to make a Khilafah, we need to break the current systems. That's one of the assumptions I'm doing. And following on that, what is the role of a faqih in your theoretical Khilafah? And I would be grateful if you answer the question by looking at the works of Sheikh Ali Khomeini, where he talks about the Wilayatul Faqih.
Okay, so brilliant question. First, what do we do with neo-traditionalism? First of all, I would say many people who identify themselves as neo-traditionalists would take exception to painting them all with the same broad brush. But if I understand if I allow myself to make an assumption of what you mean, of those who do support the contemporary current nation state, I would say that is that is part of the problem, but that is not a new or exceptional problem, right? In almost every moment you've had people who have opposed the idea of hope, who have opposed action, who have preferred to give up when colonizers went to the Muslim world. There were those authorities, in the ulama, the Sufis, who collaborated because they thought Muslims ought not to fight, cannot fight, and they can save some authority, perhaps some have some other good if they collaborated. But there are always ulama, there are always Sufis, there are always others who fought back. And so I think that that's my response. They always have people like that. That's part of the challenge. Part of the reason why people are attracted to that logic, even some good people, many good people are attracted to the idea of giving up, is because the task looks very difficult. There is no imagination. If I tell you that Elon Musk wants to build a community on Mars in 20 years from now, how many of you will say, possible community on Mars? Colonize Mars. You think it's possible? Some yes, some no. What would make it impossible? So the idea is outrageous, but the idea is out there. In fact, if you read NASA's website, this is one of the, it's on their website as a plan, not 30 years, in fact, in 10 years. But the idea is outrageous to me ethically in many ways. Nevertheless, it's possible. But the same people who are, very likely, right? The same people, if you tell them, is it possible for Muslims to do what, many other countries have done, to create systems, unify existing systems of governance, bring different people with different ways of life together in a peaceful, functional societies, they probably will throw up their hand and say, well, Muslims can never do it. Right? So this is the problem here, is learned helplessness. We have convinced ourselves that Muslims can't do it. And if you think like that, then you throw up your hand and say, why not allow a dictator to to govern, to do whatever he wants. Anyone who questions my temporary peace because they're hungry or because they don't have any rights, they are simply, they simply do not have enough patience, do not have enough tawakkul. But of course, that's so unprophetic, that is so un-Islamic. That is not that is not the model of the Sunnah, that is not the model of the Quran, that goes against our basic theological commitments. So, but I think that once you construct the world with such hopelessness, it becomes easy to sell this agenda of despair and this theology of domination, theology that worships power, because it sees power, might as right. The second question of the role of fuqaha. I see the role of fuqaha, of Islamic law, as neither that the fuqaha have any privileged right by the reason of their education to govern, to be more pious than others, because we have seen fuqaha, many of the people that you talked about in your first question are fuqaha, nor do I see them as disqualified because of having better education in Islam. But so I see that as part of the discourse, part of the question that we should be asking. I think all of us should have basic education in fiqh. And so that will be the rule of fuqaha.
Thank you very much. I think we have a question, third row, over here.
Professor, thank you so much for your talk. My question is concerned with your advice for students, Muslims who are looking to take roles in academia. Could you give some advice as to what things to watch out for, what struggles lie ahead, what struggles are specific to Muslims, especially Muslims trying to retake and recontrol a narrative that has been dominated by Orientalism and a specific anti-Islamic sentiment? Is there things that we need to be aware of and precautions we need to take, or strategies we need to take to make sure that we are not iced out of academia and taking roles with authority in academia? Thank you.
Okay, so it's a very interesting question. A lot of good things packed in there, but I'll have to just choose one and talk about it. I don't think there is one specific agenda against Islam per se. There are many different agendas, and perhaps the beauty of that is that there are many conflicting agendas, right? And when there are many conflicting agendas, then if you understand them, then their power dissolves. If you understand them, you can pit them against each other and show their vacuity. But I would say that given that you're in really one of the best places in the world to study, and the best time, most of you anyway, the best time of your age to think about, to be hopeful about the future. What you think of today, what you have more choices and more influence, even though you have longer time and you need patience to develop. But if you start developing your projects, you in some ways will have leading positions in various different professions and places. And so in some ways you have the responsibility to carry on the work of ummatics. And so start with what you do best, which is knowledge, right? So acquire that knowledge, learn what Muslims have done, learn Islamic scholarship, learn Arabic and other Islamic languages. And I would say another advice I want to give you is don't become ideologues. Do not stick to just one school. Even if you practice one, learn broadly and stay committed to Muslims who have less than you. Stay committed to the ummah. Stay committed to the humanity at large, but the ummah as your family is at this point the most, the most poignantly suffering, no matter where you look at the world. Do not let that either bog you down and bring you down in your spirit, nor let yourself grow indifferent, because that's the easiest thing to do. So learn and have patience, because inshallah, and not too distant future, you will have that choice to make. You will have choice to make what discourses are important, what discourses are resonate, right? And I want to say, just as I was talking to Imran Mullah, who I was very impressed to learn that he's only an undergraduate. I heard his podcast with Paul Williams talking about Indian Muslims, and I was so impressed, truly, because that was very informative for me. You all can do it. That's ummatics.
Do we have another question? Yeah, go ahead.
Just with regards to the point that you raised about conflicting agendas and not being ideologues, I think there's of course a desire for Muslims towards unity, but at the same time, Muslim desire to remain loyal to Islamic orthodoxy. So how would you navigate between these two desiderata?
Oh, right. What a beautiful question. So first of all, why does there seem to be a potential conflict between the desire to be orthodox, desire to hold on to the best interpretation of Islam one arrives at, and then not really care about anybody else? All of these people who have wrong doctrines, why should I care about them? I think that that tension is a mark of, and I'm not at all suggesting that this is at all inherent in your question, but just to give you an example, this was Kharijism, the first radical movement in Islam. Precisely their problem was that they had figured out their truth and they were willing to go to extremes to kill and to eliminate all those people that they decided were not Muslim. But I think it's at a very fundamental philosophical level, there's something about Islam that maybe does not reflect as strongly in other traditions, other religions, is that in Islam you have two things, not one. Of course, you have the truth of God that is absolutely central, right? But you also have Sharia, the command of God. And the two don't always logically make sense. Here's what I mean. Imagine yourself in a building. Let's say there is a kindergarten or nursery, whatever you guys call it, and there are kids playing there. The building is on fire, and you are the only adult in the room responsible for the kids. You tell the kids, hey, we got to go. The building is on fire. In 2 minutes, there's going to be no more exit left, and we'll all die. The kids say, get out of here. We're playing. We want to play. What do you do? Logically and ethically, what do? You take those kids, you grab them, and you save them. You don't allow them to be roasted just because that's their will, right? They're kids. They don't know any better. But you don't do that with Islam, even though you have no doubt about the truth of God, do you? God says, La ikraha fi din, there is no compulsion in religion. That is a command. That is a foundation of Sharia. That says you basically let the kids play because even though there is surely fire outside, you have to obey God. You have to do it in the way that God tells you. Right? So that's the duality, that's the tension, or rather I should say, that's the balance in Islam. That there is truth, but also there is the imperative to coexist, the imperative of peace, the imperative of doing it right. And that imperative is that while you must also adhere to the truth, you have to live peacefully with Muslims as well as non-Muslims, right? The verse is about non-Muslims. Now that imperative requires paying attention to what God requires of us. How has God constituted us? And God has constituted us as an ummah. And in this ummah, you're going to necessarily disagree with people. Both Muslims historically have worked out a wonderful way of implementing the commandments of Allah and His Messenger. And one way to think about that is in hierarchy. What is most important, La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah, right? Those two testimonies of faith, that is what determines my loyalty, first and foremost, which is not to say that I exclude all those who are non-believers, but I have special loyalty to those who have these two testimonies, right? Now, because this loyalty is stronger, higher, this is top of the hierarchy, any other disagreement I'll have about less important things, such as practice or details of doctrine, that is not going to trump my loyalty of La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. I can disagree with them. In fact, this statement, and I could have given a much shorter answer if I used this statement of Abu Hanifa in one of his works, I believe is Al-Alim Al-Muta'allim, in which he says that al-wala is necessary among believers to the extent of their piety, and bara is necessary to the extent of their impiety, meaning that there is a basic requirement of being an ummah to all of those who have those testimonies. And then within that, yes, you're going to carry on your disagreements, but that doesn't trump the principle of إِنَّمَا الْمُؤْمِنُونَ إِخْوَةً, that believers are only brothers, so make peace between them.
Any other questions?
Assalamu alaikum. Jazakumullah khair for your beneficial talk. So I was wondering if you could maybe talk more a bit about when you mentioned that after the fall of the Ottomans, people felt like they had lost this spatial and temporal continuity with the Prophet. Could you maybe talk more about that, and also how we can attain this today, particularly when taking part in politics?
So after the fall of the Ottomans, this was a time that Muslims are colonized, and of course, the fall of the Ottomans we usually attribute to 1924, one act, but it had begun half a century earlier. So Muslims had quite a bit of time to think about what has happened and react to it. And of course, I'm sure you're familiar with the Khilafat movement in India, which was such a powerful movement. It was in fact the most important and most powerful movement that Indian Muslims had ever participated in. So much so that this was the movement that later became the infrastructure for decolonial, anti-colonial movements later. And in the Khilafat movement, as I'm sure you're aware, the Hindus participated with the Muslims. So it was the movement that later became decolonial movement. That was Khilafat movement. That was the movement. And the Khalifa was never the Khalifa of Muslims in India, at least not directly, even though some Mughal emperors may have a documented investiture. But this is to say that Muslims felt what was being lost, and there's wonderful history that Muslims have lost, unfortunately, of how they of how the ulama, many of the ulama, as well as many of the leaders, tried to first avert that eventuality, to avoid it, but then after that responded to it in various ways. And many of the Muslim movements, whether it's the Deoband scholarly tradition of training scholars to carry on the tradition, or political movements of Jamaat Islami, for example, or the back to Masjid movement of Tablighi Jamaat, and several other movements that are not as popular as these movements, in fact, but they were all over the place where Muslims tried to do something about it. This is just South Asia. You could say the same thing. Now, what's happening in the Arab world is more complicated, and I'll skip. But of course, the Arabs who felt betrayed by the Turks, it's often said that they betrayed the Turks and so on. But in fact, modern scholarship shows that both on the Turk side and the Arab side, it was only the elite who were doing the betraying. So the majority of Arabs never turned anti-Ottoman until after the Ottoman Empire had collapsed. If you want to know about how Muslims felt and how the culture responded to it, Professor Mona Hassan, who's at Duke University, has a wonderful book called Longing for the Caliphates that describes and compares the two falls in Baghdad when it happened and then when it happened in 1924.
Next question. Yes, brother down here.
Assalamu alaikum, jazakallah khair for a really amazing and enlightening talk. I just had a question about what practical approaches do you think Muslims can take, both on a global scale in uniting Muslim leaders, Muslim countries, and perhaps on a more local scale where we can potentially play a part in bringing together Muslim communities and, like you said, uniting the ummah once more. Jazakallah khair.
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. I mean, it's a long, and the right answer is really that this is what we are doing at Ummatics. We have online colloquia, a lot of papers, and a lot more is coming out precisely to address those questions. The short answer is that we believe that the place to start is Muslim discourse, which is not short for, and I can say this at Cambridge, you guys I'm sure are aware that usually when people think of the discourse, it just means talking and theory. But in fact, discourse is that which instructs practice. And the most practical thing in the world is a good theory. People are driven by theories. People are driven by ideas, whether it's genocidal ideas or ideas of philanthropy. These are ideas that drive human beings. We want to change those ideas. And this is why beginning now for the future, for 10, 20, 30 years from now, this is the place. Now, what are those ideas that serve as, if you will, defeaters of the ummatic sentiment that already exists? What are forms of nationalism, forms of defeatism, both in theological realm and as well as in social, political, economic realms that leads to division among Muslims? So why is it, for example, that Turkish nationalism is rising against Syrian refugees, right? What can we do better in the future so that this will not happen in the future? Of course, the major problem in this case is that dictators who will liquidate, their population rather than leave power. How do you address that? Who props up those regimes? What is the world system that allows this to happen, particularly in the Muslim world? Those are questions that are not questions of fate and predetermination. I mean, it's very much politics that you can understand. And so I guess I'll say we are asking and answering and dealing with those questions, but it's people like you are the right group of people to start helping us answer those questions. And one thing I will say is that for us, it's important to know that it's not only some kind of a political planning that is central to this endeavor, ummatic endeavor. Social relationships among Muslims, various ethnic groups, linguistic groups, classes within society, how to work, how to mitigate those differences. Those are all equally ummatic problems. Similarly, economic problems, right? Currently, for example, 3% of trade that Muslim countries engage in is intra-Muslim. Most of Muslim trade is with outsiders. How do you change that? That's a really, relatively speaking, not only an easy problem to solve, but it is one that would, this idea of regional economies already growing outside, China, Southeast Asia. Everybody is thinking about regional economics as the way to go in the future. Why is it that Muslims can't do that? So there are all kinds of ways in which you can ask these ummatic questions in all different areas, including literature, fiction, whatever you're doing, science.
Thank you for that. Do we have any other questions? Sister on this side.
Thank you so much for such an enlightening talk. I was just wondering, what a lot of what you've spoken about is sort of engaging in these political questions, obviously through this umbrella term. But what advice would you have for, or do you think that as Muslims living in the West, it is productive for us also to engage in existing political spaces, existing political structures, whether that be more the secular structures that exist in the UK? How do we go about? Do we just operate outside of that and sort of trying to develop our own novel ideas, or is there an element where we need to cross the boundaries, the so-called boundary of trying to bring those ideas or approaches into these existing spaces? That doesn't have to just be formal government, but charities that already do exist. And how is that productive, and how do we go about doing that without compromising our Islamic values when we're operating in those spaces?
Okay, so it's a wonderful question, and the challenge of this question is I come from the United States, and things are quite different there. Perhaps here there are other possibilities available to British Muslims, but in America, Muslims are much more rarefied, much smaller minority, and participating in politics happens at different levels. So at local level, for example, school boards and whatnot is something that can be done without engaging in more weighty questions. But I think that my short answer is this is very much my reading of the situation, of what is possible. I think that a strong discourse, a strong ummatic discourse, does not need to exclude local politics. It, of course, will redirect, it will preclude some possibilities, it will open up other possibilities, even some kind of collaboration is possible. I don't know what that would necessarily look like in Britain. I don't understand British politics very well. But I don't see this as an impossibility. So, for instance, there are all kinds of groups that work for the welfare of Muslims, of various Muslim causes, whether Palestine, Kashmir, Rohingya, the Uyghur, whatnot. Having Muslims should be at the forefront of knowledge production and about that, but also on local questions. Rights of Muslims are under threat often. In the United States, it's difficult for Muslims to just stay away from power because Muslims do fear that basic liberties are going to be taken away, so they participate. Now, the challenge often is that participation comes with a very heavy price tag. But how do you reduce that price tag, right? You have to often ally with the left, and the left takes positions, moral, social positions that are contradictory to our faith. Well, the only way that we can break this dilemma and this paradox that we face is by becoming more organized and being a force in localities. At least in the United States, local politics sometimes is very different from national politics, and usually local politics can in fact start trends that become national. So to give you an example, some Detroit parents, for example, stage a protest against, based on their Islamic values, against certain books being taught in their kids' public school, and that then becomes a national phenomenon. I wouldn't say it goes viral as a phenomenon. Nonetheless, it's something that makes the right think twice about attacking Muslims, because now they begin to think Muslims have this power and this moral integrity. So my point is that there are all kinds of possibilities available that only become clear when you are active and informed. And I don't see those as zero-sum actions, meaning zero-sum activities, meaning that when you mobilize for a local cause that is principled and grounded in Islam, then next time the problem of Palestine comes up, you are more organized and you have resources to raise your voice. So I think that it's possible to engage in politics. But how quite that happens is not something I can say in Britain.
Thank you for that. I think we have time for 2 more questions, if that's all right.
Sure.
So, brother, right at the back over there.
What's your plan for engaging a lot of these juggernaut institutions abroad, like using Pakistan as an example, the Deoband and their tensions with the political leadership in terms of whether to back or not? Do you have any kind of a plan as to how to engage these kind of groups which have not outright sold out, but nonetheless are trying to maintain this balance of not losing their position altogether, but they're kind of installing a glass ceiling in terms of future efforts by their behaviors? How do you think, what's your approach to engaging a lot of these huge religious institutions which are apolitical, so to speak?
So I don't know Pakistani politics, but the ulama from all of these different schools are in fact outside of particular, there are particular local politics that turns people in certain directions, but one of the beautiful things about ummatics is that we can think globally. So you have in fact many Deobandi ulama as well as others, Salafis and others, who are very interested in ummatic work and have an ummatic vision. So you can't paint them all with the same brush, and that's possible precisely because one particular movement in one country gets stuck in one political situation, and they say, well, that's because us, that's because what our authorities tell us, that's the orthodox position. But then you say, okay, well, look at bigger authorities in a different country who are taking a different position. So that, in fact, allows us that kind of freedom and an opening for dialogue and discussion and hopefully growth even. So I think that parochialism of nation-state politics is what often pins various groups in these corners, right? It's not coming out of their principles. In fact, their principles are very much ummatic. And this is something that we plan to elaborate on in our work. If you do intellectual history of the Deoband, you'll find that they were at the forefront of ummatic efforts in early 20th century.
We have a final question.
Thank you very much for your talk. I wanted to ask specifically about secularism, because a lot of what you've said, and even just speaking about Islam politically, it seems like because of the secular environment that we're in, that itself requires justification. So what exactly are obviously the unique challenges that you think secularism poses to Islam, but at the same time, how do you, navigate that discussion and making that justification within this environment?
Right, so ummatic argument is first and foremost about the Muslim world, but of course there is an underlying critique of secularism, which is in fact very much already, it's already a very well developed critique in the Western Academy. It's we won't be doing something novel. In fact, it's quite developed that secularism is not as neutral as it claims. As a system that claims neutrality, it has collapsed. It has, in fact, even given up those pretensions. And as such, I would say that we are in a good place, right? Not only secularism, but even liberalism is something that's quite, it's in crisis in the West. Right? It's crisis in America. It's in crisis in Europe, and people feel loss of meaning. People feel loss of any kind of, it doesn't provide foundation for good reasoning. Secularism and liberalism, their claim to fame is that they are more rational, whereas religion is irrational. But both traditions together, secularism and I see liberalism as sort of a sect of secularism, they produce the most irrational eruptions that perhaps we have seen in recent history, eruptions of ideas, phenomena, practices. And this is something, and not only that, but as Alistair McIntyre says in After Virtue, and I saw a poster of Alistair McIntyre's book being discussed here on campus. I was very happy. It's a book I hold in high regard. Who talks about how in post-Enlightenment thought makes it impossible for ethical reason, right, for moral reason, for virtuous life, because it takes away any foundation for how to resolve any moral conflict. So I would say that this is, intellectually speaking, this is a particularly good time to come up with better theories of how to be moral, virtuous people. And that's something that has broader appeal than just Muslims.
Well, thank you very much. I think we'll leave it there. Thank you, everyone, for your really brilliant questions. And Jazakallah khair, Professor Ovamir, for your talk and all your insights just now. I think it's been really valuable. I mean, I, for one, have learned a lot. And Jazakallah for coming to the UK, and may Allah preserve you. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you very much, everyone.